I make a motion that we reopen this hearing.
I second.
Aye.
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 128, correct?
Yep.
Yep,
Yes.
thank you. For the applicant, John Bennett.
Oh, I should call it, sorry. SH28 LLC, 28 Gin Lane, construct two-story, single-family dwelling, I believe, with attached garage and accessory pool house.
John Bennett, thank you. John Bennett for the applicant, Tim Haynes, the project architect is here, Joel Snodgrass, our historic consultant, Leah Sequoia from InterScience Research, Grant Wellman from Areas Design, Scott Schleifer, and last but not least, of course, is Bailey Larkin, also from my office. Now, we have, I know that primarily you'll be hearing from the opposition this evening, but we do have a few things that have been created in response to questions that the board had at the last meeting. The only substantive comment that we've had so far in this application about the actual architecture of the property did come from Mr. Coburn, and I do want Tim Haynes, who's here, to go over a revised west elevation. It was revised to reduce the overall height of the window dormer assembly. In addition, the windows have been changed to 3/4 as opposed to 4/5, which was previously proposed.
Can I say one thing before we do that?
Oh, sure, Scott. It's actually
It's been a really long case, and so I just thought it would be helpful potentially for some of the board members, including some who may not have been board members, when this case first started getting here, to just hear a quick state of the union. So I purchased 28 Gin in late 2015. And as you all know, it's zoned for a house pretty close to the dune at just under 18,000 square feet. And after about almost over a year and a half process, I, with help from the neighborhood and from the neighbors and you all, realized that that was not the right property to build. A house to build. A close to 18,000 square foot house that was close to the water, or to the dune. And so we threw out, because we listened to the commentary of the neighbors, which I think is really good commentary, and the board, we threw it out. And we started from scratch. And we lopped off 16 or 17% in terms of size, which we did it actually because we started with a new design. We weren't trying to in any way, just like there was like a line and get just on the other side of it, proverbially speaking. We went starting from scratch, moved it back 80 feet, and shrunk it 16 or 17
feet in what direction?
80 feet from the water, which, that is really valuable. Like, it was really painful for me to move a house that had been zoned right up near the dune that would have, unobstructed view of ocean and beach and water hitting the beach, to move it back. And instead of doing it sort of like just as little as we had to, we decided to really kind of just try to make it, like, move back as far as we reasonably could so that it was as far from the Manger's house and the Michaelchek's house as possible. It's basically epicenter. It's basically in the middle right now, as far from either house as it can be. But I wanted to make sure that you all knew that there was a big process behind that, including we had a chance to listen to Mr. Goldblum, who I think actually is a really good architect. He had a chance to meet with Mr. Haynes. I sat down with Bill Manger a couple times. Me and my wife sat down with the Michaelcheks. And there was a long process that we all went through to listen and communicate. And then I believe we proposed a compromise that was way above and beyond. This is almost 2 years ago, where we took 3,000 feet out of the house and we moved it back 80 feet. And so
3,000 square feet?
3,000 square feet of house. So the house went from about 17.5 to what is now being proposed two years ago, and was approved, thank you, at 14.5. And we moved it back 80 feet. And so, well, forget about the preserved property. We tried to be good neighbors to Southampton, and we've done that, frankly, in a lot of ways that you might know about, and we've done it in a lot of ways. We've been in this community for a long time, and actually, Mr. Punnett, I rented his house for a couple summers. He's awesome. We've been in this town a long time as renters, and now as owners of property. But we listened, and we've had a really long process. And so that, Mr. Broadley, I thought your question was a really good one. I don't think I gave a great answer 2 weeks ago. In terms of not much changing since, we'll call it a year and a half ago, that was because we had done a lot of listening and ran a big process. And ultimately, we were told by everyone that we are allowed to propose a house that we like. With a lot of input from everyone, as long as it's well within the guidelines. And so I just wanted to kind of give a quick State of the Union of that's the process from my perspective. And I believe we've expressed compromise time and again. And we have sought input a lot of different times. And so that's why it was actually, I thought, a really good question. It kind of hurt a little bit to hear that there might be a perspective of this board that we had not been willing to compromise the whole way, including the last year and a half. Because from my perspective, the last 3 years has been a lot of compromise from us. And we're happy to do more. I just, before we get into the, specific commentary, again, this property was purchased in the fourth quarter of 2015. And I have been, a taxpayer, a happy taxpayer, and member of Southampton's community now for, this is the 15, 16, 17, this is the 5th calendar year.
Tim Nielsen, the changes that were responded.
Yeah, Tim Haynes, architect. In the spirit of compromise. So it's a very brief, listening to what you said in your comments, we went back and looked at something, and I thought you were on to something with the west shed dormer that was in the middle. So on the top is what was there before. So, and then we massaged it. We lowered the shed dormer down and changed what were 4/5 windows, to 3/4 windows, and the verticality seemed to subside, and it seemed happier. So that was the one change that we took out of last meeting. As Scott said, we're always willing to compromise and look at these things, and I think it's better. So, and that's in the submitted plans a week ago, so that we bubbled that one per what was brought up at the last board meeting. That was what I have to say from this.
Just very quickly, because I know you want to get to the other side of this, but there were some questions about additional views primarily from Mr. Broadley. I don't want to go through this other than to tell you that it's in the record. We've had quite a few additional views taken, most of which showed that the property will not be visible from the street.
Mr. Bennett,
Yes.
you said that Mr. Ayers' house was not visible from the street.
I never said that. No, I said Mr. Ayers' house. It's right on the street. I would never say Charlie Ayers' house isn't visible from the street. It's right there. It's about an 8-foot setback.
Okay, well,
You must have been mistaken. But in any event, a lot of stuff going back and forth. But it tells you about which is a great house, by the way. So it's a beautiful house, Robert A.M. Stern house. This has the additional vantage points and the methodology that Grant Wellman has put together for us. I just give it to you for your consideration.
This was in the file, is that
It's
correct?
been in the file, in the file.
And just because it was asked as part of the questions, I believe maybe from Mr. Bagman, but I could be corrected, were those photographs taken a regular person standing on the street, someone of 5 or 6 feet tall, standing on the street?
Say how you took them.
That was the only thing that was missing, were they in a car, was it a person, was it on a ladder?
It's in the letter, but have
That's
Mr.
in the
Wellman.
letter.
Yes.
I didn't see that part of it, I saw all the
Yeah,
other details.
it's in this,
We were
it's
standing
this, is that
Let him
right?
respond.
at my eye height. Grant Wellman, landscape architect with Eris Design. I was personally standing at my eye height, which is approximately 5'6" for all of those photos.
Okay.
Thank you. So again, I didn't, you can view them yourself, but I don't want to go. The only other thing I wanted to bring to the board's attention, well, there's two things, just very quickly. We'd explained this before, but you do have this in the file. Again, the whole design, in addition to moving back, just wanted to be very specific about what my client was talking about. The regulatory setback for this house is 100 feet from the crest of the dune. And that's the way the original application was, 100 feet from the crest of the dune. As you can imagine, the closer you get to the crest of the dune, it's part of the value of a oceanfront house, obviously. The Mangers house sits quite literally in the dune, in a location that you couldn't have today. In terms of compromise, in terms of real pain, and it is from a fair market value point of view, but also from a pleasure and aesthetic point of view, Mr. Schleifer did move the house back 80 feet further than required from the crest of dune. I have never seen that done. In all my 37 years of representing people on oceanfront properties, I've never seen anyone voluntarily move an oceanfront house 80 feet further back. Why? Because now it was a concession to the Mangers that the house is now, the closest part of the Schleifer house is now 123 feet from the Manger house, which, by the way, is 61 feet above sea level. Our house is 52. And from the Michaelchek house, the garage, the attached garage, is 131 feet, which is about, 18, 15, something like that, 20, well under the 35-foot height limit. The closest part of the house, the main part of the house, is 232 square feet. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to put them in the center where they belong, sacrificing a significant amount of what you want on an oceanfront property, a $40 million oceanfront property, which is a view of the water. Now, and these are things that have to be taken into account. The other thing I wanted to point out to the board, and then I'll sit down, is the square footage numbers that were given by the objectants, because one of the things you have to look at is the size of the homes in the neighborhood were significantly off. In the last submissions, the objectants said that the house at the 140 Gin, which is the Harris house, which is, by the way, we both worked on that. That's one of Tim's design, and we did a lot of zoning work on it. They said the house was 1,380 square feet in size. The actual house of that, square footage of that house is 15,850. They listed the Michaelchek residence using the mass appraisal numbers, which I don't even use in the Zoning Board of Appeals. I use them, they're wildly off. They listed the Michaelchek house at 8,499 square feet. The Michaelchek's own architect, which we got from Village Records, and we submitted all that to Mr. Bragman and to Mr. Handler, is 10,080 square feet. Most glaringly, 56 Gin Lane, the objectants said, was 10,000 square feet, again, taken from the town's master appraisal. That house is 19,000 square feet, taken from the architects. And as a matter of fact, Tim and I are also working on that house as well. So that's important because the numbers that have been submitted to you by the objectants in terms of the square footages of the surrounding houses were incorrect. They were taken from a source that is an estimate from the appraisers. So the house at 28 Gin is 14,560. I just want to add one last thing in terms of how this board has very recently treated similar homes at 65 Cooper's Neck Lane on 3.5 acres, 3.5 acres, which is less than this 3.8 acre parcel. a 15,161 square foot house adjacent to a site with a contributing structure of 4,000 square feet was approved in one night. 15,161, 65 Cooper's, and exist a house.
Makes me feel bad, John. Come
Excuse me?
Let him make their own, just make
No,
me
no,
feel
no.
bad.
Scott, let me finish. Let me do my job, please. There's a little bit of colloquy that's interesting here.
But that's not a historic district.
Yes, it is. Not only is it a historic district, it's next to a contributing structure. It was next to
yeah.
a contributing structure. So the point is, here you have a 14,500 square foot house next to a 10,000 square foot contributing structure, and that's much higher.
Is that one on the corner?
Yes, it's on the
Okay,
corner of
thank you.
Cooper's.
I don't
But
know
it's
what
interesting
that
because, Mr. Highsmith, I have no concerns about the length of dimension broadly by essentially agree it's compatible with the area and harmonious, especially with the open space that's to the south of it. That's the old Mezzacapa farm. That's not protected from development. Mr. Schleifer has an adjacent property that he, with much treasure, protected from development in perpetuity. Mr. Highsmith, to Mr. Broadleaf, you're okay with the mass? Yeah. The size? Oh, yeah. So again, Bo will tell you under the line of cases, Knight versus Amelkin, you have a serious problem. Would be my humble suggestion, doing anything to the contrary in this house. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Okay, great. And that's it on 28? Yep. Mr. Handler, is there anyone who would like to comment on 28 Gin Lane? Oh, who's coming?
I don't know. Who could it be?
You.
All right, I guess
Your
then
name's,
I'll
please
read. My
state
name
your
is
name.
Michael Goldberg.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg.
Okay.
Boom.
Okay. Thank you again for listening to me on 28 Gin Lane. When the project was approved in 2017, when I was before this board regarding it, I was directed that the board could not consider a design's mass, size, height, or other bulk-related standards. Since then, as I read it, the court's
I'm sorry, height?
I'm sorry, not height, sorry. Mass, size, or other bulk-related standards.
That's not true.
That's what my recollection was of the conversation.
Well, I'm just telling you that's not true.
I'm sure it's not true, but that's my recollection personally of having stood there and heard the chair at the time say pretty much that. My recollection could be totally wrong.
The transcript.
In that case, I beg your forgiveness. However, the court case that I read from Judge Pastoressa said that the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation may consider size or scale of the proposed dwelling and may reject an application if it finds that the scale of the construction is not compatible with the property or the neighborhood. Any such determination must be supported by sufficient evidence. I'm going to try to show you that I think that there is sufficient evidence. This testimony will make the case that when scale and size are considered, the proposed design is not compatible with its context. The Southampton Historic Code and Design Guidelines, in discussing scale and size, suggest that what matters in determining a new design's appropriateness is how it looks. Its apparent scale, as opposed to the actual numerical floor area or lot coverage. We feel, though, that in order to try to understand it, it helps to quantify and measure what we believe would be felt by anyone seeing the built results. That this proposal is larger and longer than its context, and that its presence would be felt as creating a jarring discontinuity from that context. Okay. Might remember this one from last time. It's not a whole lot different. In this case, we believe that it is appropriate to look at this design as it affects two nested contexts. The first is the block in which it sits, bounded by Gin Lane, the beach, and Little Plains Road. The second context is Fairleigh. Fairleigh is at the center of the block, one of the most historic lanes in the village, bounded by a remarkable array of homes dating to the start of the summer colony. The proposed development site forms the western border between Fairleigh and the rest of the Gin Lane block, abutting most of the properties on Fairleigh's west side. So in order to fit into its context, it must complement and relate to both the scales of Fairleigh and of the overall block. This is a larger version of the block. I'll leave it off to the side. You guys know it way better than me. But what it does show you is the relative density on Fairleigh, at least on the west side of Fairleigh. And if you compare that to the openness and kind of the variation in the larger block and also on the west side of that block, it's very distinctive. The two contexts have somewhat different characteristics. The block as a whole has some very large estates and some smaller homes. The variety of styles on the block is broad, with Tudor Revival, Federal, and other styles complementing the shingle style. Some of the lots are very large, spanning from Gin Lane to the beach, while some are smaller. Fairleigh has a different rhythm and scale. Its west side has 6 lots, all of a similar size. The lots are smaller, the houses are more closely spaced than is typical of the block as a whole. So instead of feeling like large estates, the west side of Fairleigh has a more suburban cadence. The houses are more closely spaced, more uniform in scale from one to the next. The houses along this stretch are, with one exception under renovation, uniformly shingle style, sharing a visual vocabulary that reinforces the uniform quality of the setting. The east side has 3 lots, 2 smaller and 1 more typical of the block as a whole. As Mr. Snodgrass said last hearing, Fairleigh is unusual in its scale and rhythm. But I would argue that it is the board's responsibility to protect this special place and weigh both the context of Fairleigh and the block as a whole when looking at the appropriateness of this particular design. Numbers. Okay. The relative scale of the proposed design can be judged by comparing it with a pattern of development on the block as a whole and on Fairleigh. This pattern can be described by comparing the averages for building size, measured in square feet, and the footprint of the houses, which tell us how big the house is and how much ground it covers. In response to Mr. Bennett's comments at the last hearing and just now, we have carefully drawn the numbers from a variety of sources to the best of our ability, including, in order of preference, Bennett and Reed's analysis, then documents and drawings from InterScience, GFA, from the homeowners themselves, and when nothing else was available, from the town of Southampton's GIS appraisal data. So, just to help explain this complicated and big board, which you'll get, we'll send that in as part of the record. I don't have it with me, but I will send it in. What we did is we logged every house on the block, identifying the Fairleigh houses and the Gin Lane houses. Each house is designated with a color. If it's in black, it comes from Mr. Bennett's diagram. If it's in blue, it was data provided by the owners to us. If it's red, it's from the town of Southampton GIS tax data. And I know, as an architect, you work with these tax data sometimes, they are not particularly accurate. But when comparing, what we tried to do is we tried to give the benefit of the doubt to the applicant. And if we could make a judgment based on that data that would make the existing houses bigger, we tried to do it. For instance, in all the houses where we have the town of Southampton data, when we were trying to figure out the footprint, what we did is we took, basically when you look at the data, and I have examples of it here if you want to see it, I'm sure you've probably seen it a lot more than me. you don't get much. You get listings like this that say the basement, the garage, the living area, and the porch. Now, according to the code, a garage may, under certain circumstances, not count as gross floor area. A porch may or may not count as gross floor area. What we did is without being able to research every single house, we assumed that every garage, every square foot of every garage, and every square foot of every porch counted, which makes the existing houses where we use the GIS data as big as they could be. So with that in mind, and granting that the numbers may not be accurate, our argument is basically, if they're not accurate, they're not so inaccurate as to give a false impression to you as to the relative size and impact of the buildings. So, where was I? Okay. So we treated footprint we treated footprint and gross floor area in the most positive way to the applicant as possible. By doing this, we're trying to make this presentation as fair as possible. Okay. The numbers are important only to the extent that they allow us to talk about and compare qualities of the houses that we think a viewer would experience irrespective of the numbers. So, with that in mind, the average size of a Fairleigh house is 7,510 square feet. The block average is 8,903 square feet. The proposed house at 14,561 square feet is 93% larger than the Fairleigh average and 63% larger than the block average. The footprint of a typical Fairleigh house, the average is 4,011. For the block, for the Gin Lane block as a whole, it's 4,674. The proposal for 28 Gin Lane is 8,547. That's 113% larger than the average Fairleigh house and 82% larger than the block. The most important things that these statistics tell me is not only how big the proposed design is, but how it is disproportionately spread out compared to its size. So while it is 93% larger than the Fairleigh average, the footprint is 20% more anomalous than its size. So not only is it big, but it's spread out for its size. This tells us that irrespective of size, this design is dispersed broadly over its site, maximizing its impact on its surroundings and heightening the contrast with its neighbors. Okay, so the exaggerated impact, where the side is made more impactful by the footprint, results from a critical and non-contextual choice. The design takes the distinctive form of a courtyard house, where the house's volumes are shaped to create the walls of a grand outdoor room, the central court. The garage forms the entry arch, with the living and bedroom wings forming the other two sides of an 114 by 64 foot formal landscaped space. The courtyard house as a type was much employed by Gothic Revival, Tudor Revival, and later arts and crafts architects in England and the USA, including Lutyens and Voysey. This is the 28 Gin Lane. This is a Lutyens house called the Orchards, and these are some views of those. And we're comparing that to the block here and an aerial view of the block here. One of the key inspirations for the 28 Gin Lane design, the Salutation House, gatehouse in Sandwich by Edwin Lutyens, is interestingly an excellent example of the freestanding pavilion strategy. Unlike the Orchards we showed on the previous page, this one, and other Lutyens houses, this building is set in a village, goes to great lengths to set the main house apart as a standalone pavilion, much like the houses on this block. The gatehouse, which is placed hard up against a country road, is the mediator between a small town urban setting and the open parkland in which the main house is set. You can see from the aerial view, this right here, right on this road, is the gatehouse. You can see the road literally comes up to the base. And then you go through it, and you're kind of in a court, and the house itself is surrounded by landscaping. Okay. To create the court at 28 Gin Lane, the rooms are strung out along one side of a long corridor, stretching the floor area thinly around the courtyard space and adding to the size of the house with long, single-loaded hallways. The house here is thus pushed to the edges of the site to accommodate the court. The decision to design a courtyard house on this relatively narrow site thus forces the house to be inefficiently spread thin across the property, increasing its visual impact and exaggerating its already non-contextual bulk. A more appropriate strategy would have simply consolidated the mass of the house into a central pavilion, more densely developed around an interior corridor or hall. This is the traditional way shingle-style classic summer homes and most of Southampton's historic district homes are planned. There are no other courtyard houses on this block today. The archetypal house in Southampton's historic district is a freestanding pavilion surrounded by landscaping. The Isaac Bell House and the William Lowe House, two McKim, Mead and White shingle-style classics, show this more traditional layout. Rooms on both sides of the house cluster into clumps that accommodate the program more efficiently and more compactly, reducing the length of the corridors, making the house feel less imposing. Volumes like these can be located closer to the center of their lots, allowing the houses to be sited in a more spacious, casual way, typical of the block and of the shingle style. Shingle-style houses were meant to recall the informal architecture of early America: barns, farmhouses, other modest rural buildings. It's worth noting that the precedents shown to support the courtyard design for 28 Gin Lane were for the most part English arts and crafts designs, not shingle-style designs. The consequences of this choice on the appropriateness of the design can be seen when looking at the longest dimensions of the houses. And for this we used, we don't have it here, we basically had to either use the data that we could find or we had to measure it. So again, it's probably not by any means perfect, but I think that relatively speaking it stands up when one looks at aerial documents and other data that we could collect. The average maximum length of a house on Fairleigh is about 95 feet, and on the block is around 100, a little more than 100 feet. The 28 Gin Lane longest facade is 216 foot, 3 inches, which would be about 127% longer than Fairleigh and 102% longer than the block average. The house is unusually long. The west facade at 216 feet is longer than a Manhattan city block. While its elevation is highly articulated, as you can see here, the animation takes place within a shallow depth of only 69 inches, with some of the steps being as little as 14 inches. If the design were built, it could look from Gin Lane like a block-long false front, out of scale, varied in profile and color, but so flat that it feels flimsy.
I want to understand. 69 inches is what the maximum setback?
Right, that's from the outermost to the innermost.
On the entire 216 feet?
On this portion here, this portion's set back more.
Okay, but you said, and how long is the portion for which it's only 69 feet?
This is 151 plus the porch, which I don't have the dimensions for, so it looks like it's around, hold it, 15, around another 15 feet.
And how big are the step backs that you've calculated for that portion?
3'9".
The rest of the for the other portion beyond 150 feet. Yeah.
I don't have that dimension either. It's on the architectural plans,
right,
but it looks like it's another 15 to 18 feet, I would guess.
Thank you.
So the shingle style abounds in long houses, but as the best examples illustrate, it always relieves those extensive facades with highly sculpted three-dimensional modulation. McKim White's Bith Harbor in St. James, Long Island, for example, has a very long facade, broken up with a deep two-story porch, changes in plane and finish, and a projecting two-story tower. The placement of the pool house exacerbates this misallocation of mass across the site. Only 27 feet from the main house and aligned with its most prominent gable, it feels like an extension of that volume. Most other pool houses or outbuildings on the block are usually removed from the main house and can be viewed as freestanding pavilions from the house. Not all, but many. The average separation on the block is about 71 feet, again measured visually using aerial data. Nearly 3 times as far as this house here. This is from the gatehouse, from the pool house. Thus obviously encroaching on the dune as well. Getting, the mass of the ensemble is a little closer to the dune than it was accounted for in the remarks just made. Right. The applicant has argued that one should not judge scale, size, and other dimensional factors without considering the size of the lots on which the houses rest. By that measure, 28 Gin Lane is relatively underbuilt, since the property is quite large. This view, I would argue, is not supported by the Village Historic Preservation Code or its guidelines, and runs counter to historic preservation practice. The intent of those codes is to foster visual continuity with the existing historical context. That context, as perceived by the public when they experience the district, is visual and sensual. It doesn't consider property lines or zoning data. The historic preservation codes operate in parallel with zoning, addressing different concerns, using different tools and different standards. The measurement here is visual and experiential, an environment created by old and new structures. So the size of the lots, while germane to zoning concerns, are less relevant to your jobs as preservation. The visual and experiential relationship of the proposed design to its neighbors is what this board is evaluating, regardless of lot size. By that measure, when experiencing this house next door to its much smaller neighbors, I believe that the result would violate the guidelines' clear admonition regarding scale. Quote, a stark contrast of scale between adjacent buildings is visually disruptive. I would argue that a more appropriate way to understand the relationship of the house to its context is to try to quantify how a visitor would experience the rhythm of buildings in this district, in this block. One cannot see property lines or property boundaries, but one does see the buildings scattered across a relatively flat landscape. That relative sighting allows us to form an aesthetic appreciation of the scale of the development on the block and on Fairleigh. The houses on Fairleigh, as we talked about before, are much closer together, but they're separated from the surrounding estates by a comfortable margin, reinforcing that quality of an enclave on Fairleigh. As noted by the chair at the last meeting, it's this board's, in my opinion, proper practice to downplay or consider, less importantly, landscaping when considering issues of visibility, scale, detail, and other factors under its purview. While landscape screening is important and is integral to the experience of the district, it is ephemeral, it can vary over time, and so it is, in our view, appropriate that the board considers visual aspects and relationships between buildings irrespective of screening, shrubbery, and trees. To quantify the sighting, we look at the physical distance between buildings irrespective of property lines. We used data provided by Mr. Bennett's surveyor, and we've identified where on this plan. And where that was not available, we used Google Earth, and we tried to scale the Google Earth dimensions to the ones provided by the surveyor so that we could get some level of comfort about them. Again, it's our argument that the particular numbers are less important than the physical, experiential realities that we think they indicate. So, with that caveat again, what we did basically, as you can see here, is we tried to measure the space between the houses, both in the block and on Fairleigh, and then from Fairleigh to the rest of the block to the east and west. And here's what we found. The average space between the homes on Fairleigh is about 150 feet. On Gin Lane, the average is around 213 feet. But from 28 Gin Lane is around 133 feet from its Fairleigh neighbors. Sorry about that. So, and Fairleigh is set apart from Gin Lane by wide margins. The average separation of the smaller scale Fairleigh houses from the Gin Lane buildings is around 250 feet. You can see that here and in these. So 28 Gin Lane, whose proportions more closely resemble the grand Gin Lane estates, is as close to its Fairleigh neighbors as they are to each other, and is considerably closer to them than any of the other large estates are to each other or are to Fairleigh. So by crowding the Fairleigh houses, its larger mass would shatter the spatial relationship that now characterizes this block. It should also be noted that the plans for 28 Gin Lane call for raising the ground plane across much of the property by up to 4 feet. While the house must meet FEMA codes requiring that the first floor elevation be raised above the current grade, regulations do not force the filling of the entire site. Traditionally, shingle-style homes and many houses on this block are raised above grade by a few feet, with steps and porches mediating the difference, and often with stone or brick below the first floor line, as noted in the guidelines, in this middle image here. This was taken from the guidelines. And these two lower images show other buildings on this block that have steps, a porch, grand stairs leading up to the main entry level. The wholesale reconfiguration of the ground plane in this proposal is a massive modification to the site, a change that literally alters the context by changing the ground plane in the historic district while creating an atypical design at the ground where the shingles come within inches of the raised grade. A further argument has been advanced by the applicant. The stylistic elements of the house's design, its massing, its roof line, its materials and details, can counteract or offset or mitigate its size. The quality of a building's detailing and proportions can exacerbate or ameliorate the impact of the mass, but it cannot fool the eye into not seeing. This is why the Historic Preservation Code and guidelines emphasize the need for this board to consider overlapping and independent criteria, scale and detail, siting and style, with each factor contributing to the overall appropriateness of the scheme. Just like this board would not approve a tiny 3,000 square foot cottage in a historically inappropriate style or with poorly conceived details, so it should not approve a house whose raw size and bulk are inappropriate to the context, even if its style and detailing are otherwise appropriate. By and large, we did not find that the overall architectural details of the proposal were inappropriate to the district, though we noted above how the long west wall was very shallow. The south-facing beach facade, however, is architecturally distinct from the rest of the house design. At grade, an open covered terrace here and here I'm sorry, here, flanks a central unadorned clapboard bay, an unusual feature for a first floor in a traditional house. Behind it is a stair that connects the first floor terrace with the second floor. This rather large structure has no openings and is relatively blank. Normally in a shingle-style arts and crafts and Tudor revival home in the historic district, the first floor living spaces, even on beach-facing facades, are often characterized by broad covered porches with upper floors rendered more solidly with smaller punched openings. Here, the house planning is inverted because of the dune to get more views. So the first floor winds up reading, in some ways, like a basement. The second floor centers on a broad, open deck. The oversized window grouping at the center features a large plate glass window and is topped by a flat roof. And the reason we modified the elevation here in this elevation was to try to give a sense of the dimensionality and relative planes of the facade. The west gable is set back around 17 feet. The roof line above the second floor appears in elevation to be symmetrical, but the massing is quite asymmetrical, as the applicant's model showed. The west gable is set back. In front of it are several flat-roofed pergolas. The deck is enclosed by a continuous glass railing. All of these elements, the massive clapboard stair structure, the flat-roofed pergolas, the plate glass window with a flat roof, all of these are not consistent with the stylistic elements of the house design itself, the other facades, with the historic precedents cited, or with the design qualities of the historic district, and we believe they should be revised. In addition, we would suggest that the board direct that the house be redesigned to reduce its bulk and scale, to be more consistent with the historic norms of the context, the overall size, the footprint, the distance to neighboring buildings, and the length, while re-examining the proposed ground plane infill and regrading. Fairleigh is acknowledged to be one of the district's gold standards. This property immediately impacts most of the Fairleigh West houses. The board should hold the design to be suitable to that higher standard and require that the scale, size, siding, and massing of any new buildings be compatible with its most immediate neighbors. Thank you.
May I ask a couple questions?
Of course.
You said that shingles near the grade is not typical for the area. What, can you give sort of percentages of shingled houses that have shingles near the grade versus raised from the grade? But it's not typical.
Based on my reading of the guidelines and my understanding of the shingle style as a general style,
So
and it was not based on my examination of each house.
Okay.
But the elevation of the structures off of grade it did seem to me, based again on viewing what I could view, it did seem to be a relatively common detail that houses had usually a few steps up from grade and did not enter on grade.
And you pointed out what you felt were some shortcomings, in particular on the first floor of the south elevation. The
Clapboard, yeah.
right. Will that be visible from a public right-of-way?
Is the beach considered a public right-of-way?
Yes.
So can
The
it
sight
be?
line will allow viewing of the
No,
first floor?
then it's behind the dune, so the answer is probably no.
Okay, thank you.
The beach is a public right-of-way. Let me just...
I don't know how far up, I don't know how far up the dune you
know,
can get where we're looking, but
like-
my guess is that it might not be.
To his first question, for instance, Meadow Beach, one of the historic houses about 3 down toward the east, has an entire brick facade on the first floor. The living quarters are on the second floor because it was built so that when the water came over the dune, you could open these like doors and it would go through and not knock the house down, and that house survives. So that's the sort of ultra of doing that. But they also have the views of the water. Yeah.
Point taken.
Maybe I'd ask either one of you, would there be a difference in the shingle style versus the arts and crafts style about the depth of the shingles down to the grade versus being stepped up?
No, I don't think there'd be a distinction there.
Okay.
I have a quick question. I'm curious as to why the Fairleigh neighborhood, if you will, is being considered as a gold standard. I'm just quoting you because I don't...
In reading about it, in my experience of it, when I hear people talk about it, it seems to have a very special place in people's hearts. And maybe I'm just hearing things that are incorrect, but that was my understanding, both reading about it and studying it to the extent that I could. Do you feel that it's anomalous or
I think it's entirely anomalous.
But it's also so early.
Render it inappropriate to be judged as a context
Just
within a
answering your
historic district?
Yeah, I feel that in this particular neighborhood, not just the particular block, but rather the entire stretch of Gin Lane and the ocean front and the so-called estate area that stretches to the north, it's quite anomalous to have relatively large-scale houses for the period set on relatively small lots for the period.
Right.
And if you look at the maps that have been...
No, I don't disagree with that, but does the fact that this old aberrant array mean that this board should not protect that feature as a historic feature?
No, I'm not a decision maker. I'm simply...
Well, in your advice, in your analysis.
I'm making two observations. One is that I fail to see why this particular stretch of houses is a gold standard. Two, it is quite anomalous, and therefore to hold whatever is constructed elsewhere along Gin Lane, etc., to that anomalous configuration is certainly challenging. And that's a very substantial challenge that has to be addressed.
I would respectfully fully respond to that. And the way I would do so is to say, historic districts are preserved and special because sometimes of their quirks and because of their development over time in unusual and unexpected ways. I think that the appearance of Fairleigh as a relatively dense cluster at the center of a block of estates is not something which should be viewed as an aberration that does not merit protection by the board. I would say the opposite. I would say that its aberrantness, its quirkiness, its outstandingness is exactly what the board is weighed with judging and considering. And and the whole notion of context as a determinant of appropriateness has to do with, hey, we have a bunch of historic facts here. These are contributing houses. And how do you make localized decisions about appropriateness for new structures in evaluating context? I don't think that you do that. I think you work from the center out. I think if you have an immediate context, and that context, even if aberrant for the block as a whole or for the district as a whole, if that area is judged to be worthy of protection, then it should be the determinant of appropriateness as judged by the standards that the guidelines set forth about scale, adjacencies, and the notion that one shouldn't put things next to one another that are jarring in their relationship.
Okay, well, that's your presentation.
Isn't Fairleigh, that was built, is one of the first, I hear often that, could
I
I
don't know if
finish?
we have time to go into
Well,
this.
could I just say that we should not fault, occasionally in these meetings, the oldest thing is faulted for being old, for being there first. These other houses were built, honestly, some of the big houses were built after, way after. And so, yes, that's another form, but I honestly believe that it is not appropriate to fault the most historic, which for whatever reason was built in a fashion that may not have held on, but and is quirky. I like quirky too, I gotta say. But, and that's not, that how the historic houses were put on the land was
It's just that in a
unusual.
historic district in which there are over 450 contributing structures, there is actually and technically nothing such as most historic.
Well, how about earliest?
We have 3 17th century period houses in the village, and I would argue
No, but
that those are the
on the
most.
beach, there's
So
fair.
I'm saying there's no such thing in the code
I don't think that the argument
most
needs...
historic.
I
And I'm
think
just
that if you're...
bringing that up.
I don't think that the contextual argument for the inappropriateness of the scale of this house depends on the value of Fairleigh being higher or lower than any of its neighbors. It only rests on the notion that context starts with the immediate environs and works its way out. So that even if, for instance, if one of the houses on Fairleigh's west side were to, let's say, be have a fire and be completely razed to the ground, I don't think that that would argue for the appropriateness of a much larger structure simply because the rest of the block is bigger, and these houses are an anomaly. I would argue rather the opposite, that Fairleigh, as a sub-neighborhood, as a distinct place, would have its own context, and that context would weigh upon the appropriateness of anything placed in that context. And I guess my argument is that, granted, 28 Gin Lane is not on Fairleigh, but it abuts it. It abuts all of the west structures on Fairleigh. And therefore, though not one of the 6 houses in a row there, its context should be measured by its adjacency to them.
Well, let me add something, if I might. And this, in somebody else's words, from the Southampton cottages of Gin Lane. And it speaks to both points. And perhaps this puts it into perspective that we might all agree upon, or at least it is, I think, a reasonable perspective. I'll just read a few short sentences. In June 1874, Alfred Nelson bought 8 acres of undeveloped land at the foot of South Main Street for slightly less than $2,100. We should be so lucky. Okay, blah, blah, blah. During the several years following his purchase, he added 2 more acres and improved the property with the necessary infrastructure to enable the creation of a park-like compound of 6 cottages. So that was the genesis and theme of Fairleigh, which makes it, if that a park in the middle of other houses makes it anomaly, so be it. Later on, the New York Times description of the compound in 1927 described it as a, quote, a hedge-enclosed park on the ocean front at the foot of Main Street, unquote, still rings true. Fairleigh embodies a casual social chicness recognizable from the vintage postcards that endure as collectibles today. So it was designed to be different. It is different. Different ain't bad in this case, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to recognize it within the context of the historic district.
As an outlier.
As a neighbor, as houses with, as an outlier, but,
I think that
and
this
also in
board's
the,
job is to
but
judge
recognizing it as part
how
of
to
the,
keep it as
excuse me,
an outlier.
Michael, just let me.
I'm sorry.
But yes, as an outlier, perhaps on the block, but as a consideration, I believe, in making our decision, in the context of that neighborhood and those environs, and that block is defined.
And I
If
think
this
that part of it,
application was on Fairleigh, I would agree with you.
I think that part of
Well, it
the
abuts Fairleigh,
part of
and
the
it's part- and
outlier
it's-
status,
it's part of the neighborhood
part
and
of
the
that
block.
isolation that Fairleigh has, I think, has to do not only with the proximity of the houses to each other, but of their distance from the surrounding houses. So there's air, you know, there's air here, and there's air here between the rest of the estates on both sides, and that more densely developed core. And I think that if you, as a board, believe that there is purpose and reason in that planning, then you have to evaluate this application based on how it modifies that planning. Because the spacing, not only is the spacing between the Fairleigh houses anomalous, but so is the spacing between Fairleigh and the rest anomalous. These are tight. There's more space than normal between that tight enclave and the rest of the block, both east and west.
So just plain devil's advocate, if the applicant decided, you know, somehow I want to replicate Fairleigh, and I want to subdivide this to 6 separate lots. Let me just finish.
Okay. Zoning.
Just let me finish. It asks for a variance for anything. For argument's sake, if it were to do so. Now you have 6 lots, 5 or 6 lots that are developed, each one of them having its own mass, its own dimension.
Right.
Would you say that'd be more of a cluster than having the separation of just singling out 2, one a manor home, one a guest home, rather than having 5 different
Are you asking me, would that be better from a historic perspective?
from a historical perspective, correct?
I guess I would have to answer no. And I think that the reason I would answer no is because Fairleigh is weird. Fairleigh is anomalous. And replicating the anomaly is not to protect it, right? Protecting it means trying to understand what makes it anomalous, special, worthy of preservation, and then figuring out how new development can both be done and preserve the best of what I mean, to a certain extent, when you're dealing with a historic district, you are being asked to put the brakes on things, to make judgments about appropriateness that balance the right to develop and the right of the public to hold on to a historic artifact. And that's a hard judgment. I certainly share your pain, especially tomorrow at 9 o'clock. But I think here, it's really, it is because it's so unusual that the challenge is not simple. You know, if it were further down the block and, you know, there was a real pattern that was uninflected, it's easy. You know, you just pop one in just like everyone else. Here you do have this weird liminal state, right, between 2 contexts. And that's kind of what I was trying to say, is that you have to look at this from both points of view. Because this abuts and forms a filter to a way of experiencing the one district or, you know, area or construct from the other, it's a hard balance that you have to make. But I think it's important to try to make sure you're looking at it from all the different points of view. And I think that the point of view of the planning context and the spatial relations between the buildings on the block is really at the core of that determination.
And I just had one follow-up question on the architecture, because I want to make sure I understand what you said. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I want to make sure I'm getting some of the main points on the architecture.
Sure.
As architecture, not with the context that you're discussing now. I'm not hearing significant, with a couple exceptions, significant concerns about the detailing of the architecture, but more the length of the building and in that length, the absence of some setbacks or other distinctions that break up the form and the rhythm of the building.
For the west wall, yes.
On the west wall in particular.
Yes.
So it wasn't that you neither sort of agreed nor disagreed with some of the detailing. You might quibble about that, and you
No,
had a couple
I
comments,
thought, you know,
but
look,
it's the
Mr.
size.
Haynes is a skilled architect and has done, there are many beautiful things about this house. I think my concerns are not with those, but with the things that I've raised.
I'm hearing about the context, some, I'm going to call them setback issues. I
I
don't
think
want
the
to
south
claim it,
facade, the south facade, I mean, I understand the reason for the upside-down house. I totally understand it. Been there, I've seen, who the hell wants to put your living room and look at sand? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think that the result is both not consistent with the house's design itself. For instance, you were commenting last meeting on the mullion arrangements and the variation between those arrangements on the east facade. I think that if you compare that facade with the south facade, you'll see a totally new window type, the big plate window in the center. I totally understand why one would want that, but I think it's worth noting that that type of window is far from historic and far from consistent with the rest of the design of the house, similar to the flat roof and totally similar to the glass rail. You show me a shingle-style building with a glass rail, I'll show you a building that was built in the last 10 years. It's not a typical material choice for a historic building. Thank you.
Oh, I want you to leave your pictures.
Oh, you can have them.
Oh, it's Lynn Manger again. I'm sorry, you're getting very tired of me, and I know it's late. I would just like to point out that fairly, the 5 original houses, there were only 3 on the west side, 2 on the east side. The original houses were built in 1884, I believe. They are the oldest houses left on the beach in Southampton. That is why it is worth thinking about them and preserving the area. The Dr. Thomas's house is no longer there. It was next door, which is why Mr. Nelson developed Fairleigh to bring people out from the city. So it may be all of the terms you've used, but it is worth saving and protecting. And originally, there were only 3 houses on the west side. It was much later on that Southampton Village decided those empty spots in between could make nice houses, and they became 6, but it wasn't designed that way. So 3 houses to your 2 houses is really not so different as it was then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Board. It's 22:11, and I know Ms. Bunkert probably has close to a half-hour presentation. The Board has had a chance to listen and absorb the comments of Mr. Goldblum, and I would respectfully suggest, based on the late hour and the intensity with which the Board has listened to the presentations thus far, as well as the anticipated intensity of Ms. Bunkert's remarks, that this matter be put over to the next session.
I would object entirely. They have taken the time, they have taken 2 hours in this process. I'm here, Mr. Schleifer's here. He's going to have to drive back to New York City. Everyone's ready to go. Hear it now. There's no excuse for it. This is the 3rd time they're saying they're not ready.
He's not
saying I'm not ready, we're saying everybody's tired.
I'm tired.
Too bad.
This is,
No, that's not too bad. I'm tired. I'm sorry I'm tired, but I am.
This is patently unfair.
It isn't patently unfair.
It
Mr.
is.
Bennett,
Stop.
we are hearing new information. There was a lot put down tonight.
This is the 3rd
A lot to
opportunity
consider.
they've had.
John, stop.
We've closed 24 to try to move things along, but there's been a tremendous amount of information, some of it pertinent, I believe, and actually new considerations for us. So I am not against closing the meeting till next time.
Is there,
Is there anyone? Please step forward. Please state your name. She's got to,
Scott Schleifer.
Yes.
I'm real tired too.
Yeah?
But we're close to the end here.
Well, you think so, but, we have to be
Or let me
close to the end,
rephrase. Let me
too.
rephrase. It's been a really long journey. And this is something that weighs on me every day and my family. And I would love to hear, everyone's here, and I'm exhausted, and I so appreciate all of you listening to this case for so long. And we got one more witness to speak.
We have one more witness. Put her on.
And I thought she was great the first time.
Board members, what's your information? I'm tired.
I know, but everyone's here. And then you hear the next
That's
meeting,
just-
they're not here. Then there's going to be weather conditions.
There's a tape. We're not talking, we live in the 21st century. I don't believe that that's the excuse.
You said you have one.
A little more. Come on. If you have a 20-minute presentation.
You don't have the floor, Bragman.
John, Mr. Bennett, excuse me.
So
He has it as much as he has. Anyone can, I'm not,
Susan, so I'm with Rob and Curtis.
So they wanna go on?
I would indulge
well, you
everybody
can't tell
says
her
they're here.
to, make it snappy.
Well, then we can close it now and we go. I can make a motion to do that too. Or we could ask Misha to keep it down to 20 or 30 minutes. There's going to be another meeting because everybody's has more to say. You've indicated that you have more people to speak. We're going to go, Scott, just so you realize, and John, we're going to take all this information, we're going to digest it. So there's not going to be a vote tonight, I don't think, and I don't want to speak for the chair, and I don't think John is asking for that. Might there be a close next week? I appreciate your tears, but it's, we have to do what we have to do. Okay?
I just want to say, it weighs on our clients too. This is a major concern to us. We have other witnesses in addition to this witness. It is 11:45 at night.
Okay.
We just spent 5 minutes.
And we are all tired, and we've had a lot of information to absorb. It's not going to ultimately slow the progress of this case.
But the board wants to hear it.
And it is more civilized. It's like, for goodness sake, we're all grown-ups here.
I'm tired. I'm beyond
How about
listening.
another
But
20 or 30 minutes and then we'll call
but
it
if
a
they're
night.
having other...
There's no point in not doing it when everyone is fresh. We have another witness. She shouldn't be rushed. We've been through this before when our witnesses were not allowed. Excuse me, I have the floor.
We have a right to disagree with your opinion.
That's
We
fine.
as a board.
I have a right to make a statement.
You can,
We are
but
all
that statement could have been
tired,
heard
and you
speaking.
will be fresher as we will. We have more than this witness. Ultimately, you're not deciding the case tonight. We're going to adjourn it anyway. Let's start at a reasonable time.
I appreciate
This is
you
why
thinking
we
about me.
brought up a procedural mechanism. Excuse me, Mr. Heisman.
Well,
Please.
you've just spent 20 minutes talking about
I spent 3 minutes talking, and I'd rather not be interrupted if you don't mind. Please. This is why we suggested early on that we had a mechanism where you could
Let's not go there,
set a
Mr.
time so that it wouldn't get into
We
this.
can't do special projects for special people.
This is the same hour that we adjourned the
I personally am
last time.
tired. The rest of the board, how do you feel? I'm tired. Okay. I make a motion that we close, that we adjourn for all purposes
I'd
until,
like to ask a question first. I'd like to get a sense of how many more witnesses we might expect to hear
I
on
don't
this
think you
case.
can ask that.
Can I ask that question?
I don't
Just
think
to-
it's a
for common
normal-
sense?
I think 3.
Who are they?
No, it's not up to you to argue.
He's making an application to close it early. Stop it. He's making an application
Okay,
to
this
close
is
it
odd.
early
That's it.
based upon some fiction
I make a
about
motion
additional
to-
witnesses.
well, sit
Who are,
there.
excuse me, we're being civil, you said
Yes.
civil, this is inappropriate.
I know, I think it's time to go
Time to
home.
close this meeting. Time to close this
Do I have
meeting.
a motion to adjourn for all purposes? The application of LSH 28 until, what's it, February?
February 25.
25th. Do I have a second?
Well, wait a minute, I want the stuff that was submitted put into the record, so at least I have that.
Well, that's a fair point. I just want to make sure, because I think Mr. Goldblum, you said that the materials you presented for 28 will also be put into the record, copies of that, or a file will be submitted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we get the time?
Yeah,
What's the time on that? He's got them. Can I have them?
No, he doesn't.
I had to, no. I had 2 days to put them in the
Let's just
record
do it.
last time. 2 days.
Do I have a second?
No, wait a minute. This is a discussion on the motion. I'd like to know when Ms. Goldblum was going to put in the
That's
stuff
not
that he
my
put in this evening. And that was requested by one of the board members.
We got information from Mr. Bennett
No, don't go back.
on Wednesday of this week, okay? We will get those to you as soon as we can.
When's
He
as
has
soon
the
as we
boards.
can? You
He
held me
doesn't
to
have-
days.
He has
Come
the
on, Bo.
large charts. He doesn't have the small charts for you.
Could you get, what do you, what is
sets of rules.
an approximation of when this,
Probably the end of the week.
okay.
That's the time.
All I wanted was an
Do
answer.
I make a motion to close the application of 28, SH 28 LLC for all purposes? Second? I did. Yes. Voting? Rob?
I vote nay. I'm going to be able to, but I vote nay.
Nay? Aye. 3 to 2, the motion carries.
Can I just ask?
No. Don't go there. Wait, I haven't adjourned the meeting. I just closed that.
Close the meeting.
Okay, why don't you make a motion then,
Motion to
Curtis?
close the meeting of the Architectural Board of Review and Historic Preservation.
Second? Aye.
Aye.
All right.